My name is Arthur Kellerman, and I am 79 years old. 2 months ago, at a family dinner at my son's house, he stood up near the end of the meal, and in front of his wife and both of my grandchildren, announced, with the particular confident finality of a decision already made, that the family had discussed it and decided we were selling my house. That at my age it simply made more sense for me to be in a smaller, more manageable place closer to him. I sat there quietly for a long moment, and then I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a folded document I'd been carrying for exactly this occasion, and handed it to him across the table. When he opened it, expecting to see his own name listed as the beneficiary who'd eventually inherit that decision-making authority, he found, instead, an entirely different name on the deed. Someone he'd never once considered might already hold legal ownership of the house he'd just announced plans to sell. If you've ever had your own future decided for you by someone who never once thought to ask what you actually wanted, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about punishing my son for overreaching. It's about what happens when a father finally decides that being managed instead of consulted has gone on one dinner too long. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly whose name was on that deed. I need to tell you about my life and that house before I tell you about that dinner table, because otherwise a folded piece of paper won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. I spent 43 years working as a civil engineer for a regional infrastructure firm outside of Denver, Colorado, building, over those decades, both a genuinely stable career and a particular reputation for careful, methodical planning that extended into every aspect of my personal life as well. I remember, specifically, colleagues occasionally joking about my particular thoroughness, my tendency to consider every possible contingency before finalizing any significant decision. A professional habit that Doris used to say defined our entire marriage just as much as it defined my engineering career. My wife Doris and I bought our house in 1978, a modest but genuinely comfortable 4-bedroom property in a quiet neighborhood, and we raised our 2 children there, my son Bradley and my daughter Susan, building decades of memories within those same walls. I remember the specific pride we felt closing on that house, young and genuinely uncertain whether we'd made the right financial choice, watching over the following decades as that uncertainty gave way to genuine gratitude for the stable foundation it provided our growing family. Doris passed 6 years ago, a stroke that gave us no warning, and since then, I've continued living in that same house alone, maintaining it carefully, understanding every quirk of its aging systems the way only someone who's lived somewhere for nearly 5 decades genuinely can. The house has felt considerably quieter since her passing, though I've found, over the years since, a particular comfort in its familiar rhythms, the specific creak of the 3rd stair, the particular way afternoon light moves through the kitchen window, small details that connect me to decades of shared life even in her absence. I want to be honest that I've noticed, over the past 2 years particularly, a growing pattern in how Bradley discusses my living situation, an escalating concern about my age and my ability to manage the house independently, concern that began reasonably enough but that has, over recent months, calcified into something considerably more presumptuous. I remember the first time he raised the topic, roughly 2 years ago, following a minor incident where I'd had some difficulty with a stepladder while cleaning gutters. A genuinely reasonable moment of concern that I understood and appreciated at the time. I want to be fair to Bradley here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as controlling, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted son, someone who calls regularly, who genuinely worries about my well-being in ways that come from real love rather than any malicious motive. What I've noticed, though, particularly since Doris's passing, is a certain pattern where Bradley's genuine concern for my safety has increasingly translated into an assumption that he, rather than I, should be the one making significant decisions about my own life and property. An assumption I've watched develop gradually, small comments accumulating over recent visits into something considerably more overt. I remember a phone call just 2 weeks before that dinner, Bradley mentioning offhandedly that he'd driven past a retirement community advertisement and thought it might be worth looking into sometime. A comment I let pass without much reaction at the time, not yet understanding how quickly that casual mention would escalate into a formal announcement delivered in front of the entire family. I want to tell you about a specific detail that matters enormously to understanding everything that happened at that dinner table. A detail Bradley genuinely had no reason to know. 3 years ago, working with my attorney on updating my estate planning following Doris's passing, I made a decision I never discussed in detail with either of my children. I transferred ownership of the house into a specific trust structure, naming my daughter Susan, who lives considerably further away in Oregon, but who I'd had several substantive conversations with about long-term family property planning, as the trust's designated beneficiary responsible for managing the property's eventual disposition, rather than simply leaving the deed in my own name to be handled through standard inheritance procedures once I passed. I made this decision for several careful reasons. Susan had expressed, during those conversations, a genuine interest in eventually using the property, once I was no longer living there, as a rental investment that would provide long-term income for both her own family and, eventually, for my grandchildren's education funds, a plan she'd researched thoroughly and presented to me with the kind of careful, detailed consideration that gave me genuine confidence in her judgment. I remember specifically the afternoon she walked me through her proposal, complete with rental market research for the neighborhood and a realistic projection of income the property could generate over the following 2 decades, a level of preparation that genuinely impressed me, given how casually most family conversations about inheritance tend to unfold. Bradley, meanwhile, had mentioned, on more than one occasion during recent visits, a preference for simply selling the house outright whenever the eventual transition occurred, wanting the straightforward cash value rather than any ongoing property management responsibility, a preference he'd expressed casually, almost in passing, never with the kind of detailed planning Susan had brought to her own proposal. I don't fault Bradley for preferring simplicity, but the contrast between the two approaches genuinely shaped my eventual decision about how to structure the trust. I want to be honest that I never formally discussed this specific trust arrangement with Bradley, partly because the conversations with Susan had developed somewhat organically over several visits, and partly because I genuinely didn't anticipate Bradley taking unilateral action regarding the house before any of us had a fuller conversation about long-term plans. I understand now, with the clarity that comes from watching events unfold, that this gap in communication contributed directly to what happened at that dinner table, a gap I take genuine responsibility for, even as I recognize that Bradley's specific choice to announce a decision rather than initiate a conversation represents its own separate failing. 2 months ago, I was invited to Bradley's house for a family dinner, an occasion that included his wife, Karen, and my 2 grandchildren, ages 14 and 11. The dinner proceeded pleasantly enough through the main course, ordinary family conversation about the children's school activities and Bradley's recent work projects, Karen mentioning a garden renovation she'd been planning, my granddaughter describing an upcoming school play with genuine excitement. Near the end of the meal, as dessert was being served, Bradley set down his fork with a particular deliberate motion that told me, even before he spoke, that something had been building toward this moment, a stillness settling over him that felt distinctly different from the relaxed conversation that had preceded it. "Dad," he said, "Karen and I have been talking, and honestly, we think it's time we had a real conversation about your house. You're 79, living alone in a place that big, and frankly, it doesn't make sense anymore, financially or practically. We've talked it through as a family, and we think the right move is selling the house and getting you into something smaller and more manageable, maybe closer to us here. I've actually already reached out to a realtor friend of mine to get a preliminary sense of what we could list it for." I sat there for a long moment, absorbing not just the substance of what he'd said, but the specific framing, "We've talked it through as a family," a phrase that notably excluded any actual conversation with me, the person whose house and whose life were apparently already being decided upon. I noticed the specific confidence in his tone, The way he mentioned already contacting a realtor, as though this represented natural next steps in a decision, rather than the very first time I was hearing any of it. I noticed my grandchildren glancing between their father and me, sensing, the way children often do, that something significant was unfolding that they didn't fully understand, my granddaughter's fork pausing halfway to her mouth, her eyes moving carefully between the two of us. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though a real sting was certainly present. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired recognition of exactly how far this pattern had progressed, from genuine concern into outright presumption, a decision about my own property being announced to me, rather than discussed with me. I reached into my jacket pocket, where I'd been carrying a folded copy of the trust documentation for the past several weeks, having anticipated, based on recent conversations, that some version of this exact moment was likely approaching. I'd made the decision, sitting alone in my kitchen the week before, to start bringing that document with me to family gatherings, some instinct telling me that Bradley's mounting comments about my living situation were building toward exactly this kind of unilateral announcement. I slid the folded papers across the table toward Bradley, watching Karen's eyes widen slightly as she registered that I was producing something significant. "Before we go any further with this conversation," I said, keeping my voice level, "I think you should look at this." Bradley unfolded the document with visible confusion, scanning through the legal language until his eyes landed on the specific section naming the trust's designated beneficiary, his brow furrowing as he read, then reread, the specific paragraph. I watched his expression shift from confusion into genuine shock as he processed what he was reading, his fork forgotten entirely on his plate now, both hands occupied with the document itself. "This says Susan," he said slowly, looking up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years, something between disbelief and genuine hurt. "This says the house is in a trust, and Susan is the beneficiary responsible for its disposition." "Dad, what is this? When did you do this?" "3 years ago," I said, "after some conversations your sister and I had about long-term planning for the property. I structured it this way because Susan presented me with a genuinely thoughtful plan for how the house could continue benefiting this family long after I'm gone, rather than simply becoming a one-time cash transaction." Karen, who had been quiet through this exchange, spoke up carefully, glancing between her husband and me with the particular diplomatic caution of someone trying to de-escalate a moment that had clearly caught everyone off guard. "Arthur, I'm confused. Does this mean Bradley doesn't actually have any say in what happens to the house?" "It means," I said, "that the decision about this property's eventual future isn't Bradley's to unilaterally announce at a dinner table, the way he just did. It's a decision that requires actual conversation, ideally with me directly, while I'm still very much capable of participating in it myself, and with Susan, given the specific arrangement we've put in place together." Bradley sat there, still holding the document, his face carrying an expression I recognized as genuine, uncomfortable reckoning. "Dad, I had no idea about any of this. I thought, as your son, I'd naturally be the one handling these decisions eventually. I never imagined you'd already made specific plans with Susan that I wasn't even aware of." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the discomfort of that realization sit a while longer, let him fully absorb the weight of having announced a major decision about my life without ever once actually asking what I wanted. But I thought of Doris and the particular grace she always modeled in difficult family moments, and I found something steadier instead. "Bradley," I said, "I need you to understand something important, and I need you to actually hear it. I'm not upset that you're concerned about my safety and my ability to manage the house independently. That concern comes from a good place, and I appreciate it. But you stood up at this table tonight and announced that the family had already decided to sell my house, without ever once asking me what I actually wanted, without any real conversation about my own preferences for my own remaining years. That's not concern, Bradley. That's a decision made about me rather than with me, and I think it's worth examining why you assumed that was appropriate." Bradley was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through genuine shame. "You're right, Dad. I think somewhere along the way, I started thinking of your independence as a problem to be managed, rather than something I should actually be consulting you about directly. I never had a real conversation with you about what you actually wanted for your own future. I just decided, based on my own anxiety about your safety, that I knew what was best, and I moved forward with that assumption without ever checking it against what you might actually prefer." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "And Bradley, I want you to understand something else. The reason this arrangement exists with Susan isn't a punishment or a message about who I trust more between the two of you. It reflects specific conversations we had about a specific plan she presented, one that happened to align with what I wanted for the property's long-term future. If you'd had a similar conversation with me, presenting your own thinking about what should happen to the house, we might have arrived at a different arrangement, or found some way to incorporate both of your perspectives. But that conversation never happened, because you moved straight to announcement rather than actual discussion. We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, once the initial shock had settled enough to allow for genuine conversation. I explained, more fully, the specific reasoning behind the trust structure, the conversations I'd had with Susan, my own actual preferences for how I wanted to spend my remaining years, preferences that, as it turned out, didn't actually involve selling the house at all in the near term, but that Bradley had never once thought to ask about before making his announcement. Bradley called Susan later that same week, and the two of them had, by all accounts, a genuinely honest conversation about the property and about the broader pattern that had led to this specific misunderstanding. Susan told me afterward that she'd been somewhat hesitant to discuss the trust arrangement with Bradley directly, worried it might create exactly the kind of tension that had, in fact, eventually surfaced, but that the conversation had ultimately felt clarifying rather than divisive once both of them had a chance to fully understand the reasoning behind it. She mentioned that Bradley had asked her, genuinely and without defensiveness, to walk him through her entire rental proposal in detail, wanting to understand not just that she'd been chosen, but why her specific plan had made sense to me. In the 2 months since that dinner, something has genuinely shifted in how Bradley approaches decisions about my life more broadly. He started asking, rather than announcing, checking with me directly about preferences before making any assumptions on my behalf. He visited last week specifically to have a longer conversation about my actual long-term plans, listening carefully as I described wanting to remain in the house for at least several more years, with some modest home modifications we discussed together to address safety concerns without requiring a full relocation, a grab bar in the shower, a slightly wider path cleared through the garage, small adjustments that addressed his genuine safety concerns without requiring me to abandon the home Doris and I had built our entire family life within. Bradley also asked, during that same visit, whether he might be included more directly in future conversations about the trust and the property's eventual long-term management, not seeking to override the existing arrangement with Susan, but wanting to understand his own potential role in supporting whatever plan eventually unfolded. I found his approach considerably more collaborative than anything he'd demonstrated in recent months, a genuine willingness to ask rather than assume that told me the lesson from that dinner had settled somewhere deeper than simple embarrassment. My grandchildren, too, seemed to absorb something from that evening, my granddaughter mentioning, during a subsequent visit, that she'd been thinking about the conversation, telling me, with the particular directness children sometimes offer, that she thought it was pretty cool that I'd kept the paper in my pocket the whole time, ready for exactly that moment. A small observation that told me even the youngest members of our family had understood something important about standing firm on decisions that were genuinely mine to make. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man whose son tried to sell his house without asking. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Genuine concern for someone's well-being requires actual conversation, not unilateral decisions made on their behalf, however well-intentioned those decisions might feel to the person making them. Real respect for someone's autonomy means asking before announcing, consulting before deciding, regardless of how old or how seemingly vulnerable that person might appear from the outside. I think too about how easily this same pattern could unfold in reverse. Aging parents who assume they know better than their own adult children. Decisions made from love that nonetheless strip away someone else's genuine agency over their own life. The specific direction of that presumption matters less than the underlying habit itself. The quiet, well-meaning conviction that concern justifies bypassing the actual conversation a person deserves to have about their own future. I've tried, in the weeks since that dinner, to hold myself to that same standard as I think about decisions involving my grandchildren's own emerging independence. Understanding that the lesson Bradley learned at that table applies just as directly to how I might someday be tempted to manage rather than consult the people I love most. I spent 2 months watching a pattern of presumption build toward a moment where my own son announced my house was being sold, without ever once asking what I actually wanted. Handing him that document with Susan's name on it wasn't about punishing him. It was about finally making clear that decisions about my own life required my own actual participation, not simply my compliance with whatever conclusion had already been reached without me. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family who's had decisions made about them rather than with them, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe because we have a new story like this one every week.